Good morning. I hope you have understood what I had taught in my last class, and I told you that I would start with the functions of the muscle spindle. So the first function, these functions that I will describe today are the stretch reflex and how the muscle length is maintained and how the muscle spindles take part in the voluntary movement. The three functions all are very important for your theory, oral, everywhere it is important. So we will start first with the stretch reflex. First, take the definition. Take it down, please. I have not written it down over here. When a muscle with an intact nerve supply is stretched, it contracts. Once again, when any muscle with an intact nerve supply is stretched, it contracts. So I am emphasizing on the word intact nerve supply. So unless and until there is an intact nerve supply, the muscle will not contract. So therefore, it is a neural reflex and it is a reflex. That is, whenever I say it is a reflex, it does not need the higher centers for its action. It is a reflex, it is a spinal reflex arc is responsible for the stretch reflex. So any reflex, whenever you have to define or write, you will have certain points. The first point is the receptor. The receptor is the muscle spindle. I have already described the muscle spindle in my last class. Now, what is the afferent? I hope you remember there are two types of muscle fibers, intrafusal fibers. One is the dynamic fibers and the other is the static fibers, or the nuclear bag and the nuclear chain fibers. And the nerve supply is also two types. Primary is the 1A fiber and secondary is the type 2 fibers. Center. Yes, it is already written, but otherwise I could have asked you, yes, where does the 1A fiber or the 2 fiber goes and ends? I had particularly emphasized in my last class, it goes and ends on the alpha motor neuron. The alpha motor neuron, which supplies the same extrafusal fiber. Same means the extrafusal fibers that of the same muscle. Efferent is naturally, it has to be the alpha motor neuron. What is the effector organ? Effector is the extrafusal fibers. What is the stimulus? Stimulus is stretch. Whenever you stretch a muscle with an intact nerve supply, it will contract. This is basically the stretch reflex. The response is a contraction of the extrafusal fiber. So what do you think? How many synapses are there? There is only one synapse. So if you take this diagram, this is the extrafusal fiber, this is the intrafusal fiber. Yes, this is the muscle receptor, muscle spindle. So from the muscle spindle, if you can stretch the muscle spindle, it will go and stimulate the sensory. Suppose this is the 1A fiber is stimulated. 1A will go and terminate on the anterior horn cell. This is the alpha motor neuron. The alpha motor neuron will go and terminate on the extrafusal fiber. So how many synapses are there? Forget this. Forget this. It is only a single synapse. So it is a monosynaptic pathway. It is a monosynaptic reflex. Types of stretch reflex. There are two types of stretch reflex. Just as there are two types of muscle spindles, that is dynamic and static, so similarly types of stretch reflex are also two. One is dynamic or phasic. Here what is happening? Sudden stretch, sudden increase in the length. Here what will happen? The dynamic fibers will be stimulated. Why dynamic? Because the dynamics are dynamic respond to a rate of change of stretch. As you are stretching the muscle suddenly, so that is being sensed by the dynamic fibers. There is a rate of change of stretch is being sensed by the dynamic fibers, and the response is a contraction of the muscle. It acts to oppose sudden increase in the length. Whenever the muscle is stretched, there is an increase in the length, immediately it will contract and help to oppose any increase in the length. Examples are all the deep jerks which you will be shown in your practical classes, like the biceps jerk, the triceps jerk, the supinator jerk, the knee jerk, the ankle jerk. All these jerks are deep tendon jerks. They are all monosynaptic. They are all stretch reflex. The second is the static stretch reflex, or it is also called the tonic stretch reflex, which is responsive to continuous stretch. Continuous stretch. As I am sitting over here, my back muscles are always functioning. These are the postural muscles. I am not falling down. No, because my posture is being maintained constantly. That is being, so here it is a question of sustained stretch. So sustained stretch is sensed by the static fibers, that is the nuclear chain fibers and the nuclear bag static fibers. Here the nerve is the afferent nerve is the type 2 fibers, mainly the type 2 fibers, and there is a sustained contraction of the muscle. So this is how the stretch reflex or the muscle spindle also maintains the posture, and it maintains the posture and equilibrium of the body. So the first one is the dynamic, which is sudden stretch, immediate contraction, and in the second one is a continuous stretch and a continuous contraction, which is being shown by all the postural muscles. We can stand for hours. That is because of the presence of the tonic, that is the static stretch reflex. So stretch reflex is a monosynaptic reflex, as I've already told you. I've given you the examples just now. Next comes, you have just learnt that the two nerves, the afferent nerve is the 1A or the 2 fiber, and the efferent nerve is the alpha motor neuron. Then what is the role of the gamma efferent? Because we know that the intrafusal fibers are supplied by the gamma efferent. Now gamma efferent, or the motor part of the intrafusal fiber, they are situated in the peripheral part. So when the gamma efferents discharge, the peripheral part will contract. In my last class I have also explained it. Again I am explaining, whenever this is a muscle, this is a muscle, when the gamma efferent is discharging, the terminal parts are contracting. As a result, the central part is being stretched. So when the central part is being stretched, what will happen? There will be more impulses will pass through the 1A or the 2 fibers. Stretching of the central part, which is called the loading. This will cause an increased sensitivity of the muscle spindle. So there is increased discharge of the 1A fiber. Have you understood? I hope you have. There will be, therefore, there will be increased discharge of the A alpha neuron, and there will be contraction of the extrafusal fiber. So by causing a gamma efferent discharge, you can also cause a contraction of the extrafusal fiber. This is important. Clinically, it forms the basis of Jagannath 6 maneuver. Mind the spelling. It forms the basis of Jagannath 6 maneuver. What is happening is, this is the Jagannath 6 maneuver. Now, when you are practicing the stretch reflex on a patient, what you do is actually you stretch the tendon. Suppose this is the biceps muscle, this is the biceps tendon. You strike with a patellar hammer or a percussion hammer. By striking with a hammer, you are causing stretching of the extrafusal fiber. Whenever there is a stretching of the extrafusal fiber, the intrafusal fiber is also being stretched because it lies parallel to the extrafusal fiber. So when the intrafusal fiber is being stretched, it will send impulses, 1A through the 1A fiber it will send impulses. As it is passing through the 1A, that will go and terminate on the alpha motor neuron. So alpha motor neurons will supply the extrafusal fiber. So as soon as you hit with a tendon, that is, you are stretching the tendon, there is a brisk contraction of the biceps muscle. This is a stretch reflex. Now practically what happens is, you are trying it out on your friend or a patient, but you are not getting a proper reflex. Maybe the person is very conscious, you cannot get it. The inhibition from the higher centers play an important role. So what you do is, you will have to reinforce the stretch reflex. That maneuver is called Gendra 6 maneuver. By Gendra 6 maneuver, what you are doing is, you are increasing the gamma efferent discharge. This maneuver is, what is this maneuver? Either you ask the person to clench his teeth very hard. As he is clenching the teeth, he is actually doing something. He is performing a function, some other muscle is contracting, but he is doing something. So at that moment, whenever he is asked to contract the masseters, that is the facial muscles, he will immediately, there will be a gamma efferent discharge. Simultaneously, as you are striking the tendon with the hammer, you are stretching, simultaneously he is clenching his teeth, so there is a gamma efferent discharge, and gamma efferent discharge will increase the stretch. How it is increasing the stretch? It is causing contraction of the contractile elements of the intrafusal fiber, so there is a further stretching of the intrafusal fiber, that is the central part, and therefore there is an increase in the stretch, and therefore you can get, the jerk will become prominent, that is, the contraction will become prominent. So this is one answer. The gamma efferent discharge, by Gendra 6 maneuver, you are increasing the gamma efferent discharge, which increases the sensitivity of the muscle spindle to stretch. Stretch 1, stretch 2. 1 and 2 together is producing the contraction. The second mechanism is a generalized increased excitability of the alpha motor neuron, and the third is diversion. This will again be taught in your practical classes. Now we come to the second function, that is the muscle length. How the muscle length is maintained. Now look at this diagram. Suppose this is a muscle. This is the extrafusal fiber. I have drawn the cross striations. And this is the muscle spindle in the central part. This is a normal muscle. This is normal muscle. This is a discharge of the 1A fibers. Now the intrafusal fibers constantly send discharge to the central nervous system via the 1A fiber. It is constantly sending information to the central nervous system about the length of the muscle. When even you are at rest, when you are not doing anything, my muscle is at rest, even then the 1A fibers are discharging at a very nominal rate. What type of discharge is this called? If you remember, it is called tonic discharge. It is called tonic discharge. Suppose this is the rate of, it is a slow rate of discharge is always present in the 1A fiber, informing the central nervous system about the length of the muscle. Now what happens is, you are stretching the extrafusal fiber. You are stretching the extrafusal fiber. So what will happen to the muscle spindle? Muscle spindle will also be stretched. The muscle spindle is also be stretched. As you are stretched, so what will happen to the discharge of the 1A fiber? It will increase. That is, 1A fiber discharge is now increased. So 1A fiber goes and terminates on the alpha motor neuron, which supplies the extrafusal fiber. So this will now go and terminate or make a synapse with the alpha motor neuron, which supplies the extrafusal fiber. So the extrafusal fiber will contract. So this was the normal length. Now let me make it shorter. Let me make it shorter. So extrafusal fiber is now short. So extrafusal fiber has contracted. This is the stretch reflex. And what is happening to the intrafusal fiber? Intrafusal fiber will not contract because the alpha motor neuron supplies only the extrafusal fiber, not the intrafusal fiber. So the intrafusal fiber will look something like this. It will become unstretched, or this is called unloading. This is called loading. This is called loading. This is called unloading. So there will be no discharge. Whenever the intrafusal fiber muscle spindle is unstretched or unloaded, there is no stretch, so no impulse will pass. Then the muscle will automatically relax and come back to its own length. So this is how the muscle length is being maintained. Have you understood? So spindles are constantly sending impulses to the central nervous system via 1A fibers about the length of the muscle. This is said to be tonic discharge, tonically active. This is called tonically active. Baroreceptors are also tonically active, if you remember. So that is tonically active. Next, so whenever now you passively stretch the extrafusal fiber, that is, you are increasing the length of the extrafusal fiber. This will cause stretching of the muscle spindle as it lies parallel to the extrafusal fiber. So there will be increased discharge in the 1A fiber because of loading. So there will be stimulation of the alpha motor neuron. The alpha motor neuron which supplies the extrafusal fibers. Contraction of the extrafusal fibers which shorten. So there is shortening. If you look at the previous diagram, it will be clear. The extrafusal, that diagram is from Ganong, mind it. Contraction of the extrafusal fibers which shorten. So the intrafusal fiber now gets unlocked. It gets slacked. There is unloading. There is unloading of the intrafusal fiber. Whenever there is unloading, it will stop firing. So whenever no feedback through the 1A fiber, muscle will immediately relax. If there is no feedback, the muscle will relax, and therefore the muscle length will again come back to its original length. So that is how the muscle length is maintained. This is the second function, very important function. It has come many times. These lines are from Ganong. Muscle spindle and its reflex connections constitute a feedback device that operates to maintain the muscle length. Explain. This is very interesting. Once again, this is the written portion. This is the muscle length. You will have to give the diagram. How do you explain? The muscle spindles are the receptors. They are tonically active, always sending information to the central nervous system about the length of the muscle. This is the discharge, slow discharge. As soon as there is increase in the length of the muscle, this is an increase in the length of the muscle. there is loading of the muscle spindle. The muscle spindle gets stretched as it is parallel to the extrafusal fiber. So whenever there is loading, there will be increase in the discharge. These 1A fiber goes and terminates on the alpha motor neuron. It comes and terminates on the alpha motor neuron. It terminates on the alpha motor neuron, which supplies the extrafusal fiber. So when the extrafusal fiber contracts, there will be, look at the diagram, this is unloading of the muscle spindle, and therefore there is relaxation. And muscle comes back to its own length. This is the diagram which is given in Ganong. This is the muscle at rest. These are the impulses in the sensory nerve. I am repeating it so many times because it is so important. The number 2 is the muscle spindle. Muscle is stretched. See, the length is longer than this. So therefore, the muscle spindle, here it is stretched. Look at this diagram over here. Look at this diagram over here and this. The muscle spindle is stretched. Muscle spindle is stretched, and therefore their rate of discharge is increasing. So now the muscle is contracted. It has become thicker. And what happens to the central part? It becomes slack. This is called unloading. This is called unloading. This is called loading. And whenever, forget this part. So whenever this happens, there will be, this is followed by relaxation of the muscle. Actually here they have shown, the last diagram is increased gamma efferent discharge. When the gamma efferent discharge occurs, that is the terminal parts contract, the central part again becomes stretched, and so there will be increase in the, this is also causing a loading, increase in the gamma efferent discharge. Now coming to the role in voluntary movement, this part is actually little difficult. Now voluntary movement is done by the extrafusal fiber. That is being supplied by the alpha motor neuron. So therefore, whenever you want to pick up a load, two types of commands come from the cerebral cortex. One is the force command. Which comes via the alpha motor neuron, which goes via the alpha motor neuron, and it is responsible for the contraction of the muscle. Simultaneously, another command is also sent, which is called the position command. This is called the position command. That is, there is also a gamma motor neuron discharge. Now one thing you must remember is gamma motor neuron discharge cannot cause any visible contraction. Here by alpha motor neuron you get a visible contraction. You get a visible contraction by the alpha motor neuron, but by the gamma motor neuron, no visible contraction can occur. Then what is the importance? Why do you send a gamma motor discharge as well? When you have sent the discharge through the alpha motor neuron discharges, there is contraction of the extrafusal fiber. When there is contraction of the extrafusal fiber, what will happen to the muscle spindle? There will be unloading. There will be unloading of the muscle spindle. You remember, there is contraction, so the central part becomes something like this. This is the contraction. And this becomes like this. So this is called the unloading. So if there is unloading, as a result, what will happen? There will be no 1A discharge. There will be no 1A discharge. That is no feedback. So the muscle will relax. So if the muscle relax, again next contraction, next discharge, muscle contracts. Again the same thing occurs and muscle relaxes. So the contraction will be something like this. Contraction, relaxation for a fraction of a second. As the 1A is not sending any feedback, there will be relaxation of the muscle. So contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation. So there will be a slight tremor. There will be a slight tremor. The movement will not be a very smooth one. So now comes the role of the gamma motor neuron. Gamma motor neuron, if it discharges simultaneously, then what will happen? The gamma motor neuron causes loading. By gamma motor neuron discharge, what do we mean? That the muscle is contracting. Yes, the muscle is contracting. It is contracting and becoming shorter, but the muscle spindle, the terminal parts are also contracting. So the central part is being loaded by the gamma motor neuron discharge. I repeat, suppose the alpha motor neuron is discharging and there is contraction of the extrafusal fiber, right? The gamma motor neuron is also discharging. So as the gamma motor neuron is discharging, it is causing contraction of the peripheral end. So the muscle spindle is constantly being loaded in spite of the muscle shortening. Because of the gamma motor neuron discharge, there is constant loading of the muscle spindle occurs. So if there is a constant loading, the I1A discharge continues. 1A discharge continues throughout the movement. So 1A discharge will continue throughout the movement, and therefore what is expected? What is expected is a continuous movement. Instead of this tremor, you will get a continuous contraction. So once again, to repeat, role of muscle spindle in voluntary movement, two commands are sent by the cerebral cortex. One is a force command via the alpha motor neuron, and because of the force command, the extrafusal fiber will contract. There is also another command, the position command, that is via the gamma motor neuron. So both will discharge together, and this is called alpha gamma co-activation. This is called alpha gamma co-activation. Alpha causes contraction of the extrafusal fiber. Now gamma causes contraction of the intrafusal fiber. So intrafusal fiber contraction means the muscle spindle gets loaded. There is no question of unloading of the muscle spindle when the extrafusal fiber is contracting. There is loading of the muscle spindle, which constantly sends afferent to the central nervous system regarding the length of the muscle, regarding the shortening of the muscle. So this is also called a length servo mechanism. Now, gamma motor neuron, as I have already said, gamma motor neuron discharge causes discharge of the 1A fiber. 1A fiber goes and terminates on the alpha motor neuron. So this is also called the stretch reflex. So by gamma efferent discharge, you are also mobilizing the stretch reflex. So stretch reflex will also cause an increase in the force of contraction. So this is called the follow-up servo mechanism. This is also called follow-up servo mechanisms. During voluntary movement, alpha neurons lift the load and gamma neurons prevent unloading of the muscle spindle. They continuously send feedback to the central nervous system about the movement that is going on. As for example, I will give you an example. As for example, you are going to lift a load. You have no idea about the load. So the central nervous system sends a force command through the alpha motor neuron. So come on, this is the amount of load that you will encounter, and you cause contraction. As the alpha neuron is discharging, as the extrafusal fiber is contracting, it fails to cause any. As the load is being lifted, you fail to lift the load. So what is happening is gamma motor neuron is also discharging and informing that the load that is being lifted is too heavy. That is, the degree of contraction is not enough to produce the degree of contraction is not enough to lift the load. So what is happening? 1A fiber is constantly sending an impulse, constantly sending feedback impulse to the anterior horn cell and back to the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex that I cannot lift the load. The length that I have attained is not enough to lift the load. So therefore, that is how the length servo mechanism is occurring. So immediately the cerebral cortex will send corrective signals, will send additional signals and tell the alpha motor neuron to contract more forcefully. That is to send more discharge, and the extrafusal fibers will contract more forcefully. Simultaneously, the gamma motor neuron is also discharging and causing the stretch reflex, local stretch reflex, to increase the force of contraction, which is called the follow-up servo mechanism. So two servo mechanisms. One is the length servo mechanism, which is giving the feedback to the central nervous system about the length of the muscle, whether it is sufficient or not. That is being done by the gamma discharge. And secondly, the gamma motor neuron discharge is mobilizing the stretch reflex, and by the stretch reflex the force of contraction is again increasing. So thereby the force of contraction is increasing. This is called the follow-up servo mechanism, and now the load can be lifted. So spindle discharge continues throughout the movement, and the muscle movement becomes a smooth one. So to summarize, we have discussed three functions of the muscle spindle today. First and foremost, that is the stretch reflex, which is very important for you for your theory as well as practical and oral. So what is stretch reflex? By definition, we have learnt that whenever a muscle with a intact nerve supply is stretched, it contracts. The reflex arc comprises of a receptor, which is the muscle spindle. Afferent is the 1A fiber, terminates on the alpha horn cell. From the alpha horn cell, the alpha motor neuron goes and stimulates the extrafusal fiber. So the impulse is arising in the intrafusal fiber. Effector organ is the extrafusal fiber. There is a single synapse. It is a monosynaptic reflex. Stretch reflex is of two types, dynamic and phasic. In the dynamic reflex, you have, that is, it opposes the sudden increase in the length, whereas the static is maintained posture. The static is actually maintaining the posture and equilibrium. Most important thing I have written over here again, that the afferent from the spindle synapses with the alpha motor neuron, not the gamma motor neurons. Then I have told you about Genre 6 maneuver. Normally in stretch reflex, gamma motor neurons do not have any role. But the gamma motor neurons can also mobilize the stretch reflex. How? Gamma motor neurons cause a contraction of the contractile or the peripheral ends of the intrafusal fiber, thereby causing a stretching of the central part. Whenever there is stretching of the central part, impulses pass through the 1A fiber and causes a contraction of the extrafusal fiber, which is a reinforcement of the stretch reflex. So that maneuver will be taught in your practical class. Next, we have learned how the muscle length is being maintained. That is, we know by now, we have learned that 1A fibers are tonically active. That means even in the resting stage, it is constantly sending discharge to the central nervous system and informing them about the length of the muscle, even in the resting state. But the discharge rate is low. Whenever there is an increase in the length, the discharge rate increases. As the discharge rate increases, it will go and synapse with the A alpha, that is the alpha motor neuron, which will cause a contraction of the extrafusal fiber. When there is contraction of the extrafusal fiber, the muscle spindle inside will become unloaded, or there is slackening of the muscle spindle, so there will be no discharge. If there is no discharge, the alpha motor neuron will not be stimulated anymore, so the muscle will relax automatically. Also, whenever the 1A discharge is not present, if it is not present, no afferent or no feedback will go to the central nervous system, so the movement will not be accurate. That is how comes the role of gamma motor neuron or the alpha gamma coactivation in any voluntary movement. During a voluntary movement, alpha motor neurons are responsible for the visible movement, but simultaneously gamma motor neurons are also being stimulated, which knows how much the contraction should be, and it is constantly loading the muscle spindle so that 1A fiber continuously discharges and informs the central nervous system about the length of the muscle that is being contracting, and in that way the feedback continues throughout the range of contraction, and therefore the muscle movement becomes smooth. Thank you.